The train whistle screamed like something wounded, and Charlotte Rourke stood on the platform of Cassidy Creek's single-room depot with her trunk at her feet, and her heart locked behind 3 years of accumulated grief. The morning air tasted like coal smoke and dry August dust, and the locomotive idled 40 yards away, breathing great clouds of white steam into the pale Colorado sky. She had one ticket in her gloved hand. One way. Denver first, then east, then all the way back to Richmond, Virginia, where her sister lived in a proper house on a proper street, and where nobody got shot over water rights or buried in frozen ground before their 40th birthday. She was done. She had said it out loud to every person in Cassidy Creek who had bothered to listen, and most of them had nodded like they understood, because they did understand. 3 years on the frontier had a way of either making a person or destroying them, and Charlotte Rourke had given this land everything she had and watched it take even more than that. It had taken her business partner, Marcus Webb, to a fever last spring. It had taken her savings to a fire that swallowed the print shop she had built board by board. It had taken her pride in 100 small humiliations that only a woman trying to survive alone in a town full of men could fully comprehend. The conductor called out the boarding time from the far end of the platform, and Charlotte bent to lift her trunk handle, and that was precisely the moment she looked up. Down the main street of Cassidy Creek, moving at a run, was Dexter Brooks. He was not a man who ran. She had known him for 14 months, and she had never once seen him break into anything faster than a purposeful stride. He was the kind of man whose steadiness was almost infuriating, the kind whose calm felt like a rebuke when you were the one falling apart. He was tall, dark-haired, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from actual work rather than vanity, and right now his shirt was untucked and his hat was gone entirely, and there was sawdust in his hair and something desperate in his eyes that she had never seen there before, and it was that desperation, more than anything else, that made her fingers loosen on the trunk handle. He was carrying something. Not large, but held carefully, the way you carry something fragile or precious. She could not make out what it was from this distance. He was still running. The conductor called again, "Final boarding." Charlotte picked up her trunk handle. Dexter Brooks vaulted the hitching post in front of Harmon's dry goods without breaking stride, and she thought, absurdly, that she had not known he could do that. She stood completely still. He reached the platform steps gasping, his chest heaving, and he stopped 3 feet from her and held out what he was carrying. And when she saw what it was, something cracked open inside her chest so violently that she had to press her free hand flat against her sternum just to contain it. It was the sign. Not just any sign. It was the painted wooden sign she had lost in the fire, the one that had hung above the door of her print shop, the one her partner Marcus had hand-lettered the week they opened. It should have been ash. It had been ash. She had seen it burn. She had stood in the street at 2 in the morning watching everything she had built in Cassidy Creek reduce itself to cinders and ruin. But the sign was here, whole and unburned, and she was looking at it and not understanding how that was possible. And Dexter Brooks was still trying to catch his breath, and the train whistle screamed again, and Charlotte Rourke stood perfectly still in the August morning and felt the frontier reach up through the soles of her boots and refuse to let her go. 14 months earlier, Charlotte had arrived in Cassidy Creek in a state she would later describe to her sister as controlled desperation, though the desperation had been considerably less controlled than she let on. She was 28 years old, trained as a typesetter and printer under her father's careful tutelage in Richmond, and she had come west with Marcus Webb, who was 32 and clever with money, and had the specific kind of optimism that the frontier seemed to attract and then devour. They were business partners, nothing more, bound by a contract and a shared conviction that a town growing as fast as Cassidy Creek would need a newspaper, and that the person who provided that newspaper first would prosper accordingly. The town had been founded only 4 years prior, in 1878, during a particularly fevered period of silver speculation. By 1882, when Charlotte and Marcus arrived, Cassidy Creek had a population of just over 800, 3 saloons, 2 churches, 1 school, a marshal's office with an attached jail, a telegraph office, a general store, a hotel called the Copper Basin Inn, a livery, a blacksmith, and no newspaper. The two of them had scouted the town through correspondence for 8 months before making the journey, and everything they had read about it had proven accurate. The soil was too high and rocky for farming. The silver had mostly played out by 1880, but the town had survived by transitioning to cattle and trade towns needed communication, which meant a newspaper was not a luxury but a necessity. They had set up in a 2-room building on Larimer Street, the main commercial thoroughfare, and Charlotte had spent the first 2 months setting type by lamplight until her fingers were perpetually ink-stained, and her back ached in ways she had not anticipated. Marcus had handled advertising and subscriptions, and the delicate social maneuvering required to convince a skeptical frontier town that a woman was capable of running a press. They had called it the Cassidy Creek Courier, and by the end of their 3rd month they were printing 300 copies twice weekly, and Charlotte had permitted herself a cautious, private satisfaction. She had not permitted herself anything more than cautious, private satisfaction, because the frontier seemed to have a talent for punishing exactly that. It was in those early weeks that she first encountered Dexter Brooks, though encountered was perhaps too strong a word for what had initially been a purely transactional relationship. He owned the only lumber yard in Cassidy Creek, situated on the eastern edge of town, where the road opened up toward the foothills, and she had gone to him for shelving material for the back room of the print shop. He had been polite, measured, accurate in his estimates, and charged her a fair price, and she had thought very little about him beyond that first impression, which was competent, quiet, watchful. She had returned to the lumber yard 3 more times over the following months for various small projects, and each time their conversation had extended slightly beyond the purely transactional, in the way that conversations do in small towns where everybody's history is simultaneously private and communal. She learned that he had come to Cassidy Creek 6 years earlier from Kansas, that he had built the lumber yard from nothing after working as a surveyor for the railroad, that he lived in a house he had built himself on a half-acre lot at the north edge of town, and that he was 30 years old and unmarried, which in Cassidy Creek was a fact people mentioned about single men the way they mentioned the weather, routinely, and with the implication that something ought to be done about it. She did not think about the fact that he was unmarried. She thought about her press, her ink supply, the cost of newsprint, the politics of Cassidy Creek, which were labyrinthine and fascinating in equal measure, and the ongoing effort of being a woman in a man's profession in a man's town without appearing to be making an effort at all. She thought about those things right up until the night of September 14th, 1882, when the fire started. She never found out how it began. The official determination was a knocked lamp, possibly in the building next door which housed a bootmaker's operation, and the dry August heat had left everything in Cassidy Creek primed to burn. Charlotte had been asleep in the room she rented at the Copper Basin Inn, 2 blocks from the print shop, and the pounding on her door had come at 2 in the morning, and by the time she had pulled on her clothes and run down Larimer Street, the fire was fully established, and the roof of her print shop had already fallen in. She stood in the street in the middle of the night and watched 3 years of work and all of her remaining money burn, and she did not cry, because crying required a kind of emotional surplus that she did not currently possess. She simply stood there and watched, and the town marshal, a phlegmatic man named Aldous Briggs, stood beside her and said that he was sorry, and the volunteer fire brigade from the saloon did their best with their buckets, but the building was gone, all of it. The press and the type cases and the paper stock and the finished issues she had not yet delivered, and the sign that Marcus had painted the week they opened, the one she had been meaning to take down and keep safe for months and had never gotten around to doing. When the fire was cold enough to approach the next morning, she had picked through the ashes and found nothing worth saving. She had gone back to her room at the inn, sat on the edge of her bed, and for the first time in a very long while, allowed herself to be completely honest with herself. She had been lying to herself about the frontier for at least a year. She had been telling herself that she loved it here, that the life suited her, that the difficulty was temporary and the rewards were real. Some of this had been true. But Marcus had died 8 months before the fire, quietly and terribly of a fever that the town's only doctor had been unable to break. And after his death, she had been alone in a way she had not fully anticipated. And the truth was that she had been running on momentum and stubbornness, rather than genuine desire for quite some time. She booked her eastbound train ticket the morning after the fire. The train was leaving in 9 days' time. She had paid for it with the last of her emergency funds, a small amount she kept in a tin box at the inn rather than the bank, a habit her father had instilled in her since childhood. She spent the first 3 days after the fire settling her accounts, saying goodbye to the people she had known in Cassidy Creek, and packing the few possessions that had survived because they had never been in the print shop. She was efficient about it. She was always efficient about difficult things. She had learned that efficiency was a shield. It was on the 4th day, while she was returning a borrowed book to the town's small lending library, that Dexter Brooks appeared at her elbow as if he had been walking beside her all along, which she found mildly alarming until she realized he had simply been heading in the same direction. "I heard about the fire," he said, which was the customary opener in Cassidy Creek, since she had heard those 4 words from approximately 40 people in the past 4 days. "Everyone has," she said. "I'm sorry about the press," he said. "I know what it took to get it up and running." She glanced at him sideways. There was something different in the way he said it from the way everyone else had been saying it. The others said it with sympathy and a kind of comfortable finality. The way people say things when an unfortunate situation has been neatly resolved by the sufferer's imminent departure. Dexter Brooks said it with something that sounded more like anger or perhaps its quieter cousin, frustration. "I'm leaving on Thursday," she said, to clarify that the situation was indeed resolved. He was quiet for a moment. They walked another half-block before he said, "I heard that too." "Then you have complete information," she said, and meant it without bitterness. He stopped walking. She stopped too, because it seemed rude not to, and turned to look at him fully for the first time in this conversation. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. Not sympathy. Not the frontier standard performative respect that men in Cassidy Creek usually offered women they considered capable. Something more unsettled than that. "The Courier was good for this town," he said. "People read it. It mattered." "That doesn't help me rebuild it," she said. "I don't have the funds and I don't have the energy, and I made a decision, Mr. Brooks. I appreciate your condolences." He nodded once, slowly, as if filing information, and she walked away. And she told herself very firmly that the slight uncomfortable feeling in her chest was only the residual grief of loss, and had nothing whatsoever to do with the expression on Dexter Brooks's face. She told herself this at intervals for the next 2 days and believed it less each time. On the 6th day before her departure, she received a note at the inn. It was written on plain paper in a clear, unadorned hand, and it said, "I would like to show you something at the lumber yard if you have an hour." It was signed simply Dexter Brooks with no further explanation. She should have ignored it. She was busy. She was leaving in 6 days, and there were practical matters to attend to, and she had no particular reason to visit a lumber yard for any reason at all. She went the next morning. He met her at the gate of the yard and led her without preamble through the stacks of cut timber, past the sawing shed where 2 men were working with rhythmic concentration, and around to the back of the main storage building, where a structure had been assembled that she had not expected to find. It was the frame of a building. A small one, perhaps 20 feet by 30, but solidly framed, the the posts plumbed perfectly vertical, the cross braces set true, the whole thing smelling of fresh-cut pine in the morning air. It was, she recognized immediately, the right size and configuration for a print shop. She stood at the edge of the foundation and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "I've been working on it for 2 days," he said, from slightly behind her. "I know it's not finished, but I wanted you to see it before you decided." "Before I decided," she said carefully. "I've already decided." "I know you have," he said. "I'm asking you to look at this first and then decide again." She turned to face him. The morning light was coming in low and golden over the rooftops of Cassidy Creek, the kind of light that made the town look better than it deserved. And Dexter Brooks was standing with his hat in his hands, and his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, stripped of the customary frontier composure that most men around here wore like a second skin. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you build this?" He took a moment before answering, and she appreciated that he did not reach for an easy answer. "Because Cassidy Creek needs the courier," he said. "Because what you built here mattered and it shouldn't end because of a fire that wasn't your fault." He paused again. "And because I think you know that too, and I think you're leaving because you're hurt and exhausted, and those are good reasons to rest but not good reasons to quit." Something moved behind Charlotte's sternum with uncomfortable force. She turned back to the building frame because looking at him was briefly too much. "The press is gone," she said. "The type cases, the paper stock, everything." "There's a press available in Denver," he said. "I telegraphed the equipment dealer there yesterday. It's used but serviceable. The price is within reach if the town contributes, and I've already spoken to 6 people who are willing to do exactly that." She stared at the frame. "You telegraphed Denver. Yesterday afternoon, yes. You did this before you even asked me. I was afraid if I asked first, you'd say no before you saw what was possible." She was quiet for what felt like a long time. A jay was making noise somewhere in the pines beyond the lumber yard fence, and the sawing from the shed was steady and rhythmic, and the smell of fresh timber was sharp and clean. And Charlotte Rourke stood in the early morning with her hands clasped in front of her, and had the very clear sensation of being at the edge of a decision that would determine the shape of the next several years of her life. "I'm leaving in 6 days," she said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction and they both heard it. "I know," he said gently. She went back to the inn. She sat with her packed trunk beside the bed and her ticket on the table, and she thought about Richmond and her sister Alina's house, and the comfortable predictability of a city that did not surprise you with its hostility every 3rd day. And she thought about the building frame in the lumber yard, and the telegram to Denver, and 6 people who had already agreed to contribute. And she thought about a man who had gone ahead and built something before she could say no. And she could not decide whether that was presumptuous or the most hopeful thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. She was still deciding when she fell asleep, and when she woke up she was still deciding, and she spent the better part of 2 days in this suspended state, which was unusual for Charlotte Rourke, who was by temperament a person who made decisions and kept them. On the second morning after seeing the frame, she was taking her breakfast in the inn's small dining room when Dexter Brooks came in and sat down across from her without being invited, which was the kind of thing she normally found presumptuous and irritating, and which, on this occasion, she found she did not mind. "Good morning," he said. "It's not settled," she told him immediately. "I know," he said. "I came to tell you about the sign." She looked up from her coffee. "What sign?" "Your sign, the one that hung above the door, the painted one." "It burned," she said. "It didn't," he said. "I found it the morning after the fire in the rubble at the back of the lot. The back wall held longer than the rest and there was debris from the roof over it, and it was charred at the edges but intact. I didn't tell you right away because I wasn't sure it would clean up, and I wanted to be certain before I said anything." He paused. "It's fine. The paint is unharmed. I cleaned it yesterday." Charlotte set down her coffee cup with a small, precise movement that she hoped disguised the fact that her hands were not entirely steady. "Marcus painted that sign," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "I've seen you looking at it every time you walked past the shop. I know what it meant." She was looking down at the table. The dining room was mostly empty at this hour, just the innkeeper's wife moving between tables in the background, and the morning light was coming through the single window in long, dusty bars. And Charlotte was looking at the grain of the wood table and thinking about Marcus Webb, who had died in April with the quiet persistence of a good man, accepting an unfair outcome, and who had painted the sign himself using a brush he had bought at the dry goods store and a can of black paint, and a steadiness of hand that had always seemed to exceed what his generally chaotic nature would have suggested possible. "I'd like to see it," she said. "I'll bring it to you whenever you want," he said. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, which was the expression of a man who was trying very hard not to influence her decision by the force of his own wanting, and who was finding this effort considerable. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked directly. "The newspaper, the sign. Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him decide to answer honestly rather than deflect, and the decision was visible on his face, and she found that she liked being able to read him. "Because this town is where I decided to stay," he said. "I've been in a lot of places that were just places. Cassidy Creek is the first one that felt like it could become something real, and the Courier is part of why I believe that. It holds the town accountable. It tells people what's happening. It makes the place feel like it has a future instead of just a present." He looked at her steadily. "And because you built it, and you shouldn't have to lose it to a fire that had nothing to do with your capability or your right to be here." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds before she looked away, and those 3 seconds were longer than they appeared. "Bring me the sign," she said. "Please." He brought it that afternoon, carrying it carefully under his arm and setting it on the table in the inn's small sitting room, and Charlotte stood over it and looked at Marcus's handwriting, the careful serif letters spelling out the Cassidy Creek Courier, and something settled in her, very quietly, like a stone finding the bottom of clear water. She went to the station that evening and asked about changing her ticket. The process of rebuilding the Courier took the better part of 3 months, and those 3 months were the period during which Charlotte Rourke made the mistake, as she later thought of it, or the discovery, as she eventually came to think of it, of understanding Dexter Brooks. The press arrived from Denver on a freight wagon in mid-September, a Washington hand press that was 7 years old but well-maintained, and it required assembly and calibration. And Dexter was there for both, not as someone exerting control over the project, but as someone who understood mechanisms and was useful with his hands, and seemed to have an innate sense of when his help was wanted, and when his absence was the more helpful thing. He could read a room, or in this case a print shop, with a precision that Charlotte found unusual in anyone, but particularly unusual in a frontier man of 1882. The new building was finished by the end of the first week, roofed and sided and fitted with a proper door and 2 windows that he had sourced from the glassworks in Denver through the same freight arrangement as the press. The 6 townspeople who had pledged contributions had made good on them, and Marshall Briggs had unexpectedly chipped in as well, and Charlotte had enough to cover her operating costs for 4 months, which was enough runway to get to solvency if the subscriptions held. They held. Better than held. The fire, as it turned out, had generated a sympathy-driven surge in subscriptions that the Courier had not enjoyed even at its original launch, and Charlotte found herself printing 350 copies twice weekly by October, which was 50 more than she had managed at her previous peak. She was busy. She was good at being busy. She used it the way she used efficiency, as a shield and a structure. And as long as there was something specific to do, she could avoid examining the other thing, the slowly developing, thoroughly inconvenient awareness of Dexter Brooks that was building in her peripheral vision the way weather builds over the mountains, gradually and then all at once. It happened in pieces. It happened in the way he laughed, which was a rare enough event that when it occurred it had a quality of surprise, a sudden break in his usual composure that lasted 3 or 4 seconds, and then was quietly reabsorbed. It happened in the way he spoke about Cassidy Creek, with a careful, precise affection for the place that she recognized because she felt it herself, and had spent considerable energy pretending she did not. It happened when she discovered, entirely by accident, that he had taught himself to read and write after arriving in Kansas at age 14 with almost no schooling, and had done so through sheer persistence over 3 years, and discussed this matter-of-factly, without any apparent expectation of admiration, as though it were simply a thing he had needed to do and so had done. It happened the afternoon in October when she was trying to set a headline in the largest typeface she owned, a size that required 2 hands to manage properly, and she had been at it for 20 minutes when Dexter arrived with the lumber she had ordered for a new storage shelf, and he set down the boards and watched her for a moment, and then, without comment, stepped forward and steadied the type case she was fighting with from the other side, his hands finding the right points of balance immediately. And together they set the headline cleanly in about 30 seconds, and she looked up at him and he was looking at her, and for a single, unguarded moment neither of them looked away. It happened slowly, and it happened inevitably, and Charlotte Rourke resisted it with considerable skill for approximately 2 months, at which point resistance became more exhausting than the alternative, and she stopped fighting it, and simply allowed herself to know what she knew, which was that she was in love with Dexter Brooks and had been for some time, and this was an enormous complication that she had absolutely no idea how to handle. She was not afraid of complications, but she was afraid of this specific complication, because the frontier had already taken things from her that she had not been able to protect, and Dexter Brooks was the kind of thing you could not protect yourself from. He was the kind of person whose absence would leave a specifically shaped hole, and Charlotte had already had that experience with Marcus, who had been her friend and partner rather than anything more, and the grief of that loss had been significant enough. The thought of risking more than that was something she kept putting down and picking up and putting down again. She was in the middle of one of these internal arguments in late October, standing in the print shop in the early evening after the day's work was done, when there was a knock at the door, and she opened it to find Dexter standing on the step with his hat in his hand, and an expression that told her very clearly that he had arrived at a decision. "Come in," she said, because she could not think of a reasonable alternative. He came in and stood in the middle of the print shop, which smelled of ink and paper and the faint ghost of the cedar wood from the new building, and he looked at her for a moment and then said, "I don't want to presume anything. I want to say something, and I want you to tell me honestly whether it's welcome or not, and if it's not, I won't raise it again." She was very still. "I think about you considerably more than is reasonable given the nature of our acquaintance," he said, with the kind of careful precision that she recognized as a man choosing each word individually rather than speaking freely, a man who understood that the wrong word would be worse than no words at all. "I think you're the most capable person I've met in 6 years in this town, and I think you're brave in a way that doesn't look like bravery from the outside, because you're so self-sufficient that people don't always see the effort it takes." He stopped. "I wanted to say that, and I wanted to ask whether you'd allow me to take you to dinner at the Copper Basin sometime, as something other than a business arrangement." The print shop was very quiet. Outside, the main street of Cassidy Creek was doing its customary evening business, voices from the saloon and the sound of a wagon on the road, and somewhere a dog barking its grievances at the approaching dark. "That was a very careful speech," Charlotte said, because she needed a moment. "I've been thinking about it for some time," he said, without defensiveness. She looked at him. She made herself look at him completely, the whole of him, not just the surface but the intention behind it, the man who had built a building before asking if she wanted it, who had found her sign in the ashes and cleaned it without being asked, who had telegraphed Denver and organized 6 town members, and done all of this not because he wanted something from her, but because he believed in what she was doing and wanted to give her the means to continue it. "I would like that," she said. Dinner at the Copper Basin. He exhaled just once, a small controlled exhale that told her the careful speech had cost him more than he was letting on, and she felt something warm move through her chest, and she thought, well, there it is. No more pretending. They had dinner at the Copper Basin Inn on the first Friday of November 1882, at a corner table that the innkeeper's wife had set with slightly more attention than the surrounding tables, which was the Cassidy Creek version of blessing a courtship. The conversation was easy in a way Charlotte had not fully anticipated, though perhaps she should have. They had been talking, really talking, in increments for over a year, and this was simply the same conversation without the pretense that it was about lumber or newsprint or shelf brackets. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Missouri at 14 after his parents died of cholera within a week of each other, and that an older brother had brought him west but then left for California 3 years later, and that Dexter had been essentially self-reliant since 17. He said this without self-pity, as a simple sequence of events, but she understood from the way he spoke about self-reliance that it had cost him something, that there was a version of isolation in that independence that he had been living inside for a long time. She told him about her father's print shop in Richmond, about learning to set type when she was 12, about the specific smell of ink on new paper that had always felt to her like the smell of information, of possibility. She told him about Marcus, about the partnership and the journey west and the loss of him, and she was surprised to find that she could speak about it with grief, but without the raw edge it had carried for months. Time had done some of its work, and so, she suspected, had the past few months of rebuilding. He listened the way people do when they are actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak, and she found this more affecting than she expected. They walked back from the inn along the main street afterward, in the cold November night with the stars enormous overhead the way they only are at altitude and far from city light, and at the door of the print shop, which she was currently using as a storage space for her personal belongings since it was the sturdiest room she had, he paused and looked at her in the starlight and said, "I'd like to do this again." "So would I," she said, and meant it without reservation. They saw each other with increasing frequency through November and into December, and the nature of their conversations shifted gradually from the careful politeness of early courtship to something more honest and unguarded, the kind of talk that happens when two people have decided to actually know each other rather than only present themselves. They disagreed about things. Not superficial things, but real ones. Charlotte believed that Cassidy Creek needed a proper school district rather than the current single-room arrangement, and Dexter was skeptical of how it would be funded. She pushed back on his skepticism with figures she had gathered from her reporting, and he pushed back on her figures with practical objections about the tax base, and they argued about it with genuine intellectual engagement and considerable warmth, and afterward, over coffee, arrived at a position that was neither of their original positions but contained the best of both, and Charlotte thought, "This is good. This specific thing. The arguing that improves into something better." She published an editorial in the Courier in December calling for a school district election, citing every figure she had, and several arguments that Dexter had made during their debates. He read it sitting in the lumber yard office, and when she came by later that week, he handed it back to her and said, "This is good work," with such straightforward, unqualified approval that she felt it all the way down to her feet. The school district election was held in February 1883 and passed by a margin of 54 to 31, which Charlotte reported in the Courier with barely contained satisfaction. By then, they were no longer being subtle about the courtship, which in a town of 800 was functionally impossible anyway. The Cassidy Creek social world, such as it was, had an opinion about everything, and its opinion about Charlotte Rourke and Dexter Brooks appeared to be cautiously favorable, at least in the quarters she cared about. The less favorable quarters were the ones who thought a newspaper run by a woman was inherently suspect, and these were also the quarters who had the most reason to be nervous about the paper's editorial coverage. And Charlotte had long since decided she was not interested in the approval of people she was actively reporting on. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard in Colorado, cold enough to freeze the creek that gave the town its name, and hard enough on livestock that half the ranches within 30 miles took losses. Charlotte covered it in the Courier thoroughly, including a front-page story about the inadequacy of the county's emergency relief provisions that got the county commissioner's office in a fury, and resulted in a formal complaint being delivered to the print shop by a humorless deputy who clearly felt that delivering a letter of complaint to a woman was beneath his dignity. Charlotte had published the complaint in full in the next issue, with commentary. Dexter, reading this issue in the lumber yard, had laughed his rare, sudden laugh, and she had been across the street at the time and had heard it through the open doorway, and the sound had done something pleasant to the afternoon. There was a night in January when he came to the print shop late, because she had sent him a note saying the shelf installation had developed a problem, and when he arrived the shelf was fine, and she admitted she had needed company, which was the first time she had admitted needing anything to him or to anyone in Cassidy Creek, and he had sat with her in the lamplight of the print shop for 2 hours while she told him things she had not told anyone about the night of the fire. The specific cold terror of watching everything she had built become nothing, the feeling of standing in the street with ash on her boots and nothing left to do, and he had listened without fixing or deflecting, which was exactly right, and when she was done he had said only, "I'm glad you stayed," which was also exactly right. He kissed her for the first time in February in the lumber yard in the snow, which was not where she had imagined it happening but which turned out to be perfect. They had been arguing about something minor, she could no longer remember what, and the argument had run its course and they were standing close together in the cold with their breath making small clouds in the air. And he had looked at her for a moment and then simply leaned forward and kissed her briefly, carefully, one hand coming up to her face and then dropping. And when he pulled back she looked at him and said, "Finally," which was not what she had planned to say but was entirely true, and he laughed again. The real laugh and the sound echoed off the stacked timber around them, and she thought, This is what I stayed for, even though I didn't know it when I stayed." Spring came, and with it the renewed motion of the town, the ranchers coming in from winter quarters, the freight wagons resuming their schedules, the streets losing their frozen rigidity and becoming mud, and then dust in rapid succession, as Colorado spring moved through its phases at speed. The Courier expanded to 3 issues per week by April, and Charlotte hired a part-time typesetter named Gertrude Hale, a woman of 35 who had been doing piecework at the dry goods store, and who proved to have a natural aptitude for the work and a fierce competitive streak regarding accuracy that Charlotte found delightful. The town was changing. Cassidy Creek in the spring of 1883 was not the same town Charlotte had arrived in 18 months earlier, and some of the change was attributable to the paper, which she understood without false modesty. The school district she had helped push into being was planning its first proper building. 2 new businesses had opened on Larimer Street. The cattle trade was stabilizing after the rough winter, and the county had, under ongoing pressure from the Courier's coverage, actually revised its emergency relief provisions, a victory that Charlotte celebrated with a bottle of wine she had been saving from her Richmond stores, and shared with Dexter in the lumber yard's small office on an April evening when the air was finally warm enough to leave the window open. It was on that evening, the wine half finished and the spring air coming through the window and the yard quiet around them, that he asked her to marry him. He did it, characteristically, without excessive ceremony. He had been looking out the window at the yard and he turned back and looked at her and said, "I want to ask you something," and I want you to give me an honest answer rather than the answer you think is appropriate." "I always give honest answers," she said. "You give careful, honest answers," he said. "I want the uncalculated one." She looked at him. The lamplight was on his face, and she knew his face well now, the specific geography of it, the way it held its composure and the ways that composure shifted when he was moved by something. And he was moved now. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the particular quality of his stillness. "Ask," she said. "Marry me," he said. "I want to build something here with you in this town. I want the newspaper and the lumber yard and the arguments about school districts and all of it, and I want it with you specifically. I've wanted that for some time now, and I think you know that, and I think you want it too, and I'd rather ask plainly than spend any more time circling it." Charlotte set down her wine glass. She looked at Dexter Brooks, who had built her a building before she asked for it and found her sign in the ashes and organized her town's support, and had been steady and present, and honest through a winter that would have worn down people with less integrity. And she thought about her sister Alina's house in Richmond and the eastbound train she had not taken, and she thought about how the frontier had taken things from her but had also, unexpectedly, given her things she had not thought to ask for. "Yes," she said. Uncalculated and completely honest, yes. He stood up and crossed the small space between them and took her face in both hands and kissed her the way people kiss when the answer has been yes, thoroughly and with complete attention. And the spring air came through the window, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, rapid and real, and thought that she had been wrong about some things and right about this. They were married in June 1883. In the Cassidy Creek Church of the First Methodist Congregation, a building that was substantially less impressive than its name suggested, but which had, on the day, been decorated by the women of the town with wildflowers from the meadows above the creek with such generous excess that the flowers became the architecture, the humble walls almost invisible behind the cascades of blue columbine and Indian paintbrush and wild asters. Gertrude Hale cried during the ceremony, which Charlotte found both touching and amusing. Marshall Briggs attended in his best coat and stood in the back with his hat in his hands, and nodded with a gravity that suggested he considered this a matter of civic importance. Charlotte wore a dress she had made from fabric ordered from Denver, a deep blue poplin that she had sewn herself over 3 evenings with concentrated attention. And when Dexter saw her come through the church door on the arm of the innkeeper, who had volunteered for the duty since she had no family present, his expression was the expression of a man who has gotten exactly what he hoped for and is surprised by how complete the satisfaction is. The vows they spoke were the standard Methodist ones of 1883, and she said them with full understanding of their weight, and he said them looking directly at her without any of the nervous deflection that grooms sometimes employed, looking at her the way he looked at things he wanted to understand completely. The reception was held in the street outside the church, as was the Cassidy Creek custom for events too large for any available interior, with tables brought out from the inn and food contributed by various households and a fiddle player named Amos Cartwright, who had come up from a ranch to the south, specifically for the occasion, and played with the loose-limbed joy of a man who loved music more than he needed to be paid for it. Charlotte danced twice with her husband, which was the acceptable number for a June evening in Cassidy Creek, and she was aware during both dances of the specific warmth of his hand on her back and the way he moved, which was more graceful than his usual deliberate groundedness suggested. And she thought, I did not know he could dance. There are still things to discover. This is the pleasure of it. They built a life with the thoroughness of 2 people who had both learned the hard way that life needed building rather than simply happening to you. The Courier grew through 1883 and into 1884, adding a 4th weekly issue, expanding its coverage to the surrounding ranches and the small settlements that had grown up along the Creek Valley. Charlotte hired a second part-time employee, a young man of 19 named Tom Gillespie who had grown up in Cassidy Creek and wanted to be a journalist and was raw but willing. And she taught him typesetting with the patience her father had taught her, understanding that the skill was worth transmitting. The lumber yard expanded too. Dexter brought in a second sawyer in 1884 and added a millwork operation that could produce finished trim and molding, anticipating the building boom that was coming as the town grew. His instinct for what the town would need before it knew it needed it had always been good, and the millwork was fully operational by the time the building boom actually arrived in 1885. When Cassidy Creek's population grew by a third in a single year as the cattle trade expanded, and the new railroad spur that had been rumored for 2 years finally became real. The railroad was a story Charlotte covered comprehensively in the Courier, from the first credible rumors through the surveying and the land negotiations and the labor disputes and the final driving of the last spike. A piece of reporting that she was prouder of than almost anything else she had done, because it was complicated and she had not simplified it. Had reported the labor conditions honestly, and the land acquisition practices with critical attention to what they meant for the small homesteaders in the valley, and the reporting had consequences. 2 county officials lost their positions in the 1884 elections, at least in part because of what the Courier had printed, and Charlotte was told this directly by 3 separate people, and took the information with the quiet, fierce satisfaction she allowed herself when journalism did what journalism was supposed to do. There were difficulties too, because there are always difficulties, and the frontier did not stop being the frontier because she had decided to stay on it. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that lasted 6 weeks and cost several ranching families their margins, and Charlotte covered it and organized the Courier's first charitable fund drive, which raised enough to help 2 families through the winter. In the fall of 1884, a man named Garrett Colville, who was the owner of 2 of the 3 saloons in Cassidy Creek, and who had been subjects of multiple unfavorable Courier stories regarding the operation of his establishments, made the mistake of threatening Charlotte in the middle of Larimer Street on a Tuesday afternoon, with enough witnesses present that the threat became the main topic of conversation in the town for a week. Dexter had heard about it within the hour, in the way that news traveled in small towns, and he had come to the print shop with the most controlled fury Charlotte had seen in him, and she had told him clearly and firmly that she had already spoken to Marshal Briggs, that Briggs had spoken to Colville, that the situation was handled and she did not need him to handle it further. "I know you can handle it," he said tightly. "Then let me handle it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through it, the protective instinct against the understanding that she was right, and she watched him choose the right thing and said, more gently, "I appreciate that you came. I do. But if you go to Colville now, it looks like I needed you to fight my battle, and it will cost me credibility I've spent 2 years building." He took a breath. "You're right. I know," she said. He looked at her, and there was something rueful in it, the look of a man who keeps being surprised by the same truth about the same person. "You usually are," he said. "Not always," she said, "but about this." Garrett Colville left Cassidy Creek in the winter of 1884, his departure hastened by a Courier investigation into his liquor licensing that resulted in the county refusing renewal of one of his establishment's permits. Charlotte took no particular pleasure in the departure itself, only in the fact that the reporting had been accurate and consequential, which was all she had ever asked of it. Their first child was born in March 1885, a boy they named William, after Charlotte's father. The birth took place in the house that Dexter had extended that winter with a proper bedroom addition, and the doctor who attended was a woman named Miriam Graves who had established a practice in Cassidy Creek the previous summer, a development Charlotte had covered in the Courier with barely concealed delight, because a woman doctor in Cassidy Creek in 1885 was news of the best kind. William Brooks arrived in the world at 4 in the morning on a Sunday, loud and immediately insistent about his displeasure at the various indignities of being born, and the doctor declared him entirely healthy. And Dexter, who had spent the night in the adjacent room in a state of compressed, controlled terror that he later described to Charlotte as the most frightened he had ever been, was allowed in when it was done and stood over the small wrapped bundle and was very quiet for a long time. And Charlotte, exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure, watched his face and thought, this, also this. The Courier published a brief notice of William's birth in the following Wednesday issue, which was the sort of thing the paper did for births in Cassidy Creek, and Charlotte wrote it herself and found the process of writing it, this small official announcement of her son's existence in the public record of the town, unexpectedly moving. William grew quickly, the way babies do when you are paying attention, and the year 1885 in Cassidy Creek was a busy one. The railroad spur opened in June and immediately changed the character of the town's commerce, making goods available faster and cheaper, and pulling the town more firmly into the network of the regional economy. Charlotte covered the opening, wrote an editorial about its implications, and noted in print what she had also noted in private conversation with Dexter, that the railroad's arrival was an opportunity but also a kind of pressure, the pressure of connection to larger forces that did not always have local interests at heart. The issue of the injustice done to the Ute people who had once occupied the land that Cassidy Creek now stood on was one Charlotte had written about carefully and honestly since the paper's second year. It was not a popular subject with some of her readership, but she had always believed that a newspaper's job was to tell the truth about where things came from, and the truth of where Cassidy Creek had come from included the removal of the Ute bands from the region under the terms of agreements that had not been honored by the federal government, and that had resulted in the loss of land that had been theirs for generations. She wrote about this with the care it deserved, not as an outsider making simple judgments, but as someone trying to understand a complicated wrong, and several of her best reporting pieces on the subject came from conversations with a Ute man named Raymond Clouds on Water, who worked as a translator for the county and who had, over the course of 2 years, agreed to speak to her about the history of the land and the experience of his people with measured honesty that she reproduced in the Courier as accurately as she was able. Dexter read those pieces with the same attention he gave everything she published, and when she asked what he thought, he said he thought she was right to publish them, and that he was still working through what it meant to have built something on that land, and she said she was too, and they sat with that discomfort, which was the right thing to do with it. The fall of 1885 brought a proposition that Charlotte had not anticipated. A newspaper publisher in Denver, a man named Theodore Ashworth, who ran a chain of 3 small Colorado papers, sent her a letter offering to buy the Courier. The offer was generous, more than the paper was technically worth on paper, and included an option for her to remain as editor on a salary, which she understood was the polite fiction through which Ashworth believed he could retain her as an asset while removing her ownership. She read the letter twice, set it on the print shop desk, and did not open it again for 2 days. She discussed it with Dexter on a Wednesday evening with William asleep in the next room and the lamplight making the kitchen warm and the October wind doing its business outside. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to know what you think," she said. "I think," he said carefully, "that the Courier is yours and the decision is yours, and that my opinion about it should be secondary to yours. That said, if you want it, I think you'd be miserable as someone's employee when you've been the owner. I think Ashworth's offer is designed to look generous while being fundamentally a transfer of control, and I think you know that." She was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid the money might look attractive to you." He looked at her with an expression she recognized as being slightly wounded by the implication, which she had known it would be. "Our finances are not so desperate that I'd want you to sell something you love for money," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it out loud so we could both hear how wrong it sounded." He allowed a small smile. "And it sounds wrong," she said. She declined Ashworth's offer in a letter she wrote with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has made a correct decision and knows it, and filed the copy in the print shop's correspondence drawer, and that was the end of that. The following spring brought a development that she had not anticipated and which initially alarmed her. A second newspaper appeared in Cassidy Creek. It was called the Cassidy Creek Dispatch, and it was founded by a man named Horatio Beale, who had previously worked as a printer in Albuquerque, and who set up his operation in a building on the cross street with what Charlotte observed to be reasonable equipment and a clear intention to compete directly. The Dispatch's first issue focused heavily on commercial advertising and made no pretense of editorial ambition, which told her exactly what kind of paper Beale intended to run. Her first instinct was defensive, and she examined that instinct until she understood what it was and then set it aside. A second paper was not a threat to the Courier if the Courier was doing what newspapers were supposed to do, which was report the truth and maintain the public trust. The Dispatch could have the advertising business from the merchants, who wanted nothing more than a display case. The Courier would continue to be the paper that held the county accountable and told Cassidy Creek its own stories. She was right. By the summer of 1886, the Dispatch was profitable enough but shallow, running advertising and social notices and very little actual news, and the Courier had, if anything, strengthened its position as the paper that mattered. The two publications coexisted without significant conflict, which Charlotte found faintly anticlimactic after the initial adrenaline of the competition, and she said as much to Dexter, who laughed and said she had too combative a nature to be comfortable when there was nothing to fight. "That's probably true," she said. "It's entirely true," he said. "It's one of the things I find most interesting about you." "Most people find it difficult," she said. "Most people aren't paying the right kind of attention," he said. Their second child was a girl, born in November 1886, and they named her Ada, after Dexter's grandmother, who had been a woman he described as having so much self-possession that she could silence a room by entering it, a description Charlotte found immediately appealing. Ada arrived with considerably less drama than William had, which was the doctor's observation rather than Charlotte's, and was a smaller and more contemplative baby than her brother, given to watching things with the focused attention of someone conducting a study. Charlotte was back at the print shop 2 weeks after Ada's birth, to Gertrude Hale's vocal disapproval and Tom Gillespie's carefully unexpressed but visible relief, since Tom had been managing the paper alone for those 2 weeks and found the experience instructive but exhausting. Charlotte came back with Ada in a basket beside the press and worked with one hand while the other managed the basket, and Gertrude, after her initial protest, became Ada's most devoted infant attendant during working hours, a role she took seriously and which freed Charlotte's hands for the actual work. Life in Cassidy Creek in 1887 was more settled than it had been in the turbulent growth years. The town had a population approaching 1,200, a proper school building, a second doctor who had joined Miriam Graves in a shared practice, a new hotel that was considerably more impressive than the Copper Basin Inn, and a post office that finally had enough traffic to justify its size. The lumber yard had expanded twice and now employed 7 men full-time, and Dexter was planning a third expansion to accommodate the continued building activity in the valley. Charlotte was 33 years old and had been in Cassidy Creek for 5 years, and when she walked down Larimer Street, she felt it differently than she had felt Richmond streets or any street she had walked before coming here. She felt the specificity of it, the way each building represented a choice someone had made to stay and build, and the way her own choices were embedded in the street's character, in the school district that existed because of the Courier's campaign for it, in the changed county relief provisions, in the businesses that had opened partly because the Courier's coverage had made Cassidy Creek look like a place with a future. She still thought about Marcus Webb, and she thought he would have been pleased, and that was a good thought to have. One autumn morning in 1887, she came into the print shop early to find a letter waiting for her, forwarded through the Denver postal system, and when she opened it she found it was from her sister Eleanor, who wrote twice a year and whose letters always arrived with the quality of dispatches from an alternate life. Eleanor was well. Eleanor's husband James was well. Eleanor's 3 children were well. Eleanor hoped Charlotte was well, and hoped also that Charlotte was not working too hard, which was Eleanor's polite way of saying that Eleanor considered the whole enterprise somewhat alarming, and hoped it would eventually resolve itself into something more conventional. At the end of this particular letter, Eleanor had written, "I confess I had expected you to be back in Richmond years ago. You always said the frontier was temporary. I hope you know what you're doing, dear. I suppose if you are happy, you are doing the right thing." Charlotte read this standing at the print shop desk in the morning light, and then she set it down and looked out the window at Larimer Street, at the town she had helped build and the life she had chosen, and the sign above the door of the print shop, Marcus's sign, the one from the ashes, which she had hung there the day the new building opened and had not moved since. She sat down and wrote Eleanor a letter that was longer than usual, and in it she described Dexter, which she had never fully done before, and William, who was now 2 years old and had developed strong opinions about everything, and would follow his father through the lumber yard for hours given the opportunity, and Ada, who was approaching her first birthday, and who observed the world with the intensity of someone who intended to understand it thoroughly before participating in it. She described the Courier and what it had done in Cassidy Creek, and the school building and the doctor and the changed county provisions and all of it, and at the end she wrote, "You asked if I am happy. Eleanor, I am happy in a way that I did not know I could be, in a way that I am not sure I could have been in Richmond, because it took all of this, the hard parts especially, to make me into the person who could have this kind of happiness. I am not done with the frontier. I do not think I will be done with it for a very long time." She sealed the letter and took it to the post office herself, which was 3 blocks away, and on the way back she stopped in at the lumber yard where Dexter was in the middle of reviewing delivery records with his foreman, and he looked up when she came through the door with the expression he had for her, the one that was distinct from his expression for everything else, the one that was particular and warm and completely without pretense. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Everything is very all right," she said, and the foreman had the discretion to find something to look at out the window. The Christmas of 1887 was the fullest Christmas Charlotte could remember. Dexter had brought a pine tree into the house 3 days before the holiday, and she and William had decorated it with ribbons, and dried orange slices and small carved figures that Dexter had made through the previous weeks in the evenings, working at the kitchen table while she read or wrote with Ada in her lap, and the evenings had the quality of something she wanted to keep, to press and hold. The lamplight and the sound of carving, and the child's weight, and the tree standing in the corner, gathering its slow accumulation of small, careful decorations. They had guests on Christmas Day, Gertrude Hale and Tom Gillespie and Marshall Briggs, who had become in the years since the fire something close to what Charlotte would have called a family of choice, the people whom a life built from scratch generates around itself. Miriam Graves came in the afternoon and stayed for dinner, and the table was loud and warm and full of argument and laughter in the specific ratio that Charlotte had come to understand was the signature of the kind of life she had chosen, where the people around you were people who cared enough to disagree. After the guests had gone and William had been put to bed and Ada was asleep in her cradle beside the stove, Charlotte sat with Dexter at the cleared table with tea cooling between them, and the house was quiet in the particular way of a house where children sleep, a quiet that has presence rather than absence in it. "I was thinking about something you said once," she said. "I say quite a few things," he said. "Which one?" "When you brought the building frame," she said, "you said I was leaving because I was hurt and exhausted, and those were good reasons to rest but not good reasons to quit." He was looking at her steadily. "I think about that fairly often," she said. It was the thing that cracked the decision open. I had made it so completely and I was so certain, and that was the thing that got in. "You would have come back to the right decision on your own," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but you built something instead of asking, and that's what changed the calculus. The building was there. The fact of it made it real in a way that a question couldn't have." She paused. "I'm glad you did that. I've been glad for 5 years, and I should have told you so more clearly than I have." He reached across the table and took her hand. His hand was warm, slightly rough with the work of years, completely familiar. "I'm glad it worked," he said. "I was not certain it would." "You weren't. I thought there was a significant chance you'd find it presumptuous," he said. "I did find it presumptuous," she said. And yet, she agreed. She turned her hand in his so their fingers interlaced. The easy, unconscious gesture of long intimacy. And the stove threw its soft warmth across the kitchen. And the baby breathed in her cradle, and upstairs William was deep in the dreamless sleep of a 2-year-old. And outside the December dark held Cassidy Creek in its cold, and the stars were doing their enormous blazing work above the mountains, and Charlotte Rourke, who had once stood on a platform with a one-way ticket and a broken heart, and watched a man come running across the dust of a frontier town carrying something saved from the ashes, thought, "I could not have imagined this. I would not have known to." The years that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a life that is genuinely being lived, which is to say they moved sometimes slowly and sometimes in a rush, with beautiful ordinary days and hard days and days that were simply full of the accumulated business of existence. And Charlotte came to understand that this rhythm was not a compromise or a settling, but was in fact the texture of the thing she had wanted without knowing how to name it. She published the Courier's 500th issue in the spring of 1889, and marked it with a front-page editorial looking back at what the paper had covered since its founding, a catalog of stories that was also a catalog of the town's growth. The school district, the railroad, the changed county provisions, the water rights dispute of 1886 that had required 2 months of coverage before a fair resolution was reached, the coming of the new doctor and the new hotel and the post office, the drought years and the good years, and the death of a beloved schoolteacher named Mrs. Hendricks, who had shaped the education of half of Cassidy Creek's children, the marriages and births and the deaths, the steady accumulation of a community's record. She wrote the editorial in the evening after the children were in bed, and when she read it back the next morning she thought it was the best thing she had written for the Courier, not because of its prose, which was clear but not ornamented, but because of what it contained, which was a portrait of a place becoming itself. Dexter read it over breakfast the morning it was published, with William on one side asking repeated questions about a wooden cart he was building and Ada on the other working with great concentration on her porridge, and when he finished reading he looked up and said simply, "This is what it's for." "Yes," she said. William looked up from his cart. "What is?" He asked because William was 4 now and believed that all adult conversations were either educational opportunities or conspiracies to exclude him, and addressed both possibilities with equal suspicion. "The newspaper," Charlotte said. "Oh," William said. "Gertrude lets me help set the letters sometimes." "I know," Charlotte said. "You do it very well." "I'm going to have a newspaper when I'm big," William announced. Charlotte looked at Dexter. Dexter looked at Charlotte. Ada, uninterested in this development, continued with her porridge. "Or a lumber yard," Dexter offered. William considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old confronting a genuinely difficult question. "Maybe both," he said eventually. "Maybe both," Charlotte agreed, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay itself warm across the table, and she looked at her family in it, the 2 children and the man who had run across a dusty street carrying a sign saved from a fire, and thought, "Yes, both, all of it." The hard parts and the good parts, and the newspaper that told the truth, and the lumber yard that built the town and the house at the north edge of Cassidy Creek that smelled of pine and ink, and the specific warm certainty of a life chosen freely and kept with intention. There was an afternoon in the early summer of 1889 when Charlotte was in the print shop alone, Gertrude having gone home early, and Tom being out on a reporting errand, and she was finishing the layout for the Thursday issue when she heard the door open and looked up expecting a customer or Tom returning, and instead found Dexter in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and an expression she had come to associate with moments of intentional gravity. "I have something to show you," he said. "Again." She said, "Again," he said. She went with him. He led her down Larimer Street to the empty lot on the eastern end of the block, the one that had been sitting unbuilt for 3 years because its owner had been involved in a dispute with the town council over zoning regulations, and Charlotte saw that the dispute had clearly been resolved because the lot was no longer empty. A foundation had been laid and the framing was up, and the building taking shape was larger than she would have expected for a commercial property. "What is this?" she asked. "The new Courier building," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same expression he had worn years ago in the lumber yard, trying not to influence her with the force of his own wanting, letting her see the thing and decide freely. "You built this," she said. "The foundation and the frame, yes," he said. "I wanted to show you before we went further in case you wanted different specifications. You," she said slowly, "built me another building. The current print shop is too small," he said. "You've been saying so for a year. There's no room for a proper press room and an editorial room both, and if you're going to hire a full-time reporter, you need the space." She was quiet for a moment. A soft wind moved through the frame structure, and the evening light caught the raw pine of the new studs, and she thought about a morning in the fall of 1882 when she had stood before another building frame in a lumber yard and had felt the frontier reach up through her boots and refuse to let her go. "You did it again," she said. "I did," he said. "Before asking," she said. "I was afraid if I asked first you'd say it was too expensive," he said, "which it isn't for the record. The lot was reasonable once the dispute was cleared, and the materials are from the yard." She turned to look at him fully, and she had the sensation of completing a circle, of being brought back to the beginning of something she had not known was circular when she first encountered it. And the beginning was still here, the same man with the same impulse, the impulse to build something before she could say no to it, the impulse to make the possible visible before the practical objections arrived, the impulse that had changed her life. "You are the most infuriatingly preemptive person I have ever known," she said. "I prefer thorough," he said. "I know you do," she said. She walked into the frame of the building, under the new beams, and stood in what would be the editorial room when it was finished, and looked up at the open sky above the frame, and then out through the stud work at Cassidy Creek's Main Street with its familiar geography of buildings and people and the life she had made here, and she was quiet for a while. "Charlotte," he said from behind her. "I love it," she said. "I love it and I love you, and you should have asked me. But since you didn't, I will say yes, as I always do to the things you build without asking." He came and stood beside her in the frame of the new building, in the evening light, and she leaned against his shoulder and felt the familiar warmth of him, the steadiness she had first found infuriating and then indispensable and then beloved. And the wind moved through the open frame and carried with it the smell of pine and Colorado summer, and the faint sulfur of the telegraph office down the block. And Cassidy Creek went about its business around them with the equanimity of a town that had grown accustomed to its own continuation. "There's something else," he said. "There's always something else," she said. "I spoke with Tom," he said. "He wants to buy in as a partner. He's been saving for 3 years with exactly that in mind, and he has the money. I think he's ready." She considered this. Tom Gillespie was 26 now, had been with the Courier for 4 years, had developed from a willing but raw apprentice into a genuine journalist with good instincts and better ethics, and his dedication to the paper had been such that she had often thought it deserved formal recognition. A partner, she said. Not majority. Your paper still. But a real investment, a real stake. Someone who will still be there when you decide to take a day off, which I have been waiting 7 years for you to do. She laughed. She felt his shoulder move with the small resonance of his own quiet laugh. I'll talk to Tom, she said. Tom Gillespie became a minority partner in the Cassidy Creek Courier that summer, and the investment transformed his relationship to the work in a way that was immediately visible, the specific quality of attention that ownership brings, and Charlotte watched it with satisfaction. The new building was finished by September 1889. A proper two-room operation with a press room large enough for the new cylinder press Charlotte had been coveting from the Denver equipment catalogs for 2 years, and an editorial room with 3 desks, and a proper filing system, and a window that looked out onto Larimer Street, from which she could see most of the town's daily commerce, and which she found, in a practical way, useful for news gathering, and in a more private way, simply pleasurable. She hung Marcus's sign above the door of the new building, the same sign that had hung above 2 previous doors, the sign saved from the ashes, the sign that Dexter had carried running across the depot platform on an August morning years ago, the sign that had cracked open her certainty and allowed the frontier to keep her. The letters were slightly faded now, softened by years of Colorado weather, but legible and true. The Cassidy Creek Courier. She had touched them with her fingers the morning she hung it, standing on a step stool with the sign's familiar weight in her hands, and said something very quiet to Marcus that she did not share with anyone, and which she thought he would have heard regardless of whether the dead can hear, because some things needed to be said into the air even without certainty of reception. Their third child, another boy they named Franklin, arrived in the winter of 1890, and the house at the north edge of town was now definitively full and warm, and loud in the mornings with the specific productive chaos of a household that is genuinely alive. William was 5 and had decided that carpentry was more immediately satisfying than journalism, a decision Charlotte suspected was not final. Ada was 3 and was already the family's most organized member, a fact that the rest of them acknowledged with various combinations of amusement and slight intimidation. Franklin, arriving in January with the serene good nature of a third child accustomed from birth to being part of something already in progress, was welcomed by his siblings with varying degrees of comprehension, William having a fairly good grasp of what had happened, and Ada's opinion of the new arrangement being represented primarily by her immediate attempt to educate him, which at 3 days old he was not well positioned to appreciate. Charlotte sat in bed on the second morning after Franklin's birth with the baby in her arms and Dexter beside her, and the sound of William and Ada in the kitchen with Gertrude, who had come to help with the transition, and who was managing the situation with the brisk competence she brought to everything. And she thought about a woman who had stood on a train platform with a one-way ticket and a heart closed against the frontier, and she thought about all the distance between that woman and this moment. And the distance was not only years, but the whole accumulated weight of a life chosen and kept. Dexter was watching her watch the baby, and she looked up and found him looking at her with the expression she knew best, the one without performance or pretense, the one that was simply him seeing her. "Are you all right?" he asked, because Franklin's arrival had been harder than Ada's and the doctor had been watchful. "I'm entirely all right," she said. "You look like you're thinking something large," he said. "I was thinking about the train platform," she said. He was quiet for a moment, understanding which platform she meant. "I almost didn't make it in time," he said. "I didn't have the sign yet when I left the house. I went back for it. I almost didn't." She looked at him. "I didn't know that." "I hadn't told you," he said. "Why did you go back for it?" He considered the question with the care he gave to questions that mattered. "Because I thought if you saw it, you would understand that I wasn't asking you to pretend the hard parts hadn't happened. The fire and Marcus and all of it. I wasn't asking you to set that aside and start fresh. I was asking you to bring it with you." He paused. The sign was the hard parts, saved and cleaned and still readable. I thought if you held it, you would understand what I meant." Charlotte looked at him for a long time. The baby shifted in her arms, a small warm adjustment, and outside the window the January Colorado sky was white and pale, and the town of Cassidy Creek was going about its daily business, and the courier's sign was hung above the door of a building he had built for her a second time, and she thought, he had known exactly what he was doing. Even then, even on that platform with his shirt untucked and sawdust in his hair and the train whistle screaming, he had known precisely what he was doing. "You are not at all what I thought you were the first time I came to buy lumber," she said. "What did you think I was?" "Competent and quiet," she said. "I am those things," he said. "You are also," she said, "the most deliberately thoughtful person I have ever met, and you hide it under the competence and the quiet, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to understand that." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently, and then the baby's forehead, and she felt the familiar warmth of him and the specific quality of a love that had been built rather than fallen into, assembled board by board over years of honest argument and shared work, and the ordinary daily accumulation of a life that was genuinely, continuously, without reservation chosen. The years continued. The courier continued. The lumber yard continued. The children grew in the specific directions that children choose for themselves regardless of parental intention, and the house at the north edge of Cassidy Creek was full, always, with the noise and warmth that fullness generates. By 1892, William was 7 and spent most of his free hours in the lumber yard learning the properties of different woods from his father with an absorption that suggested this would not, after all, be merely temporary. Ada was 5 and had been found on 2 separate occasions attempting to reorganize the print shop's type cases according to a system she had developed independently, and which was, Gertrude admitted privately to Charlotte, not entirely without merit. Franklin was 2, and had the cheerful, indiscriminate affection of a person who has never had reason to doubt the world's fundamental benevolence, a condition his parents intended to protect for as long as humanly possible. Charlotte's sister Eleanor came to visit in the summer of 1892, taking the train from Richmond to Denver and the local line to Cassidy Creek, arriving on a Thursday afternoon in July with 2 large trunks and an expression of carefully composed composure that Charlotte recognized as Eleanor's strategy for situations she was uncertain about. The composure lasted approximately 45 minutes, which was the time it took Eleanor to walk down Larimer Street to the Courier Building and see the sign above the door and look at Charlotte and say, in a voice that had shed all its composure, "You actually built this." "With considerable help," Charlotte said. "But you built it," Eleanor said. "Yes," Charlotte said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "James always said you would. I told him you'd come home within 2 years. He said you wouldn't." She paused. "He was right." "He was," Charlotte said. Eleanor stayed for 3 weeks and spent much of that time following her niece and nephews through their daily circuits of the town with an expression of bemused delight, and sat for long evenings with Charlotte and Dexter on the porch of the North Edge house, and on the second-to-last evening of her visit said to Charlotte quietly, when Dexter had gone inside to check on the children, "He is a very good man." "He is," Charlotte said. "I wasn't sure from your letters," Eleanor said. "Letters don't always capture, but in person it's clear." "What's clear?" Charlotte asked. "That he sees you," Eleanor said. "Completely. Not the version you present, but the real one underneath it. I can see it in how he looks at you. It's rare." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the lighter dark of the summer sky, at the stars doing their work, at the town below them with its lights in windows and its familiar sounds. "I know," she said. Eleanor went back to Richmond and wrote a letter 2 weeks after arriving home that was the longest she had ever written Charlotte, and which began, "I understand now. I am not sure I could have done what you did, but I understand why you did it, and I am very glad for you." Charlotte kept that letter in the correspondence file at the print shop, between the Ashworth offer letter she had declined, and a letter of commendation from the Colorado Press Association that the Courier had received in 1891 for its coverage of the water rights dispute. She had never been sure why she kept the Ashworth letter. She thought perhaps it was because it was useful to have a record of the things you had correctly said no to. The decade turned. Colorado in the 1890s was changing, the frontier closing in the national consciousness, even as places like Cassidy Creek continued their daily business of being themselves. Charlotte read Frederick Jackson Turner's 1893 essay on the significance of the American frontier with considerable interest, and wrote a response in the Courier that took issue with several of his conclusions while crediting the genuine insight in his central observation. And the response generated more letters to the editor than any piece she had published in 2 years, which told her that the people of Cassidy Creek were thinking about what they were and what they had been and what they were becoming. She was thinking about it too. She thought about it in the way she thought about most things, carefully, honestly, without reaching for comfortable conclusions before she had earned them. The frontier had been real, and it had cost real things, and it had given real things, and both of those facts were true simultaneously, and the accounting of it was not simple, and she was not interested in making it simple. She published that complexity in the Courier because it was the truth, and the truth was her business. The Courier ran its 1000th issue in 1895. Charlotte wrote the editorial herself, as she had written the 500th, and it was different in character from the first anniversary piece, deeper and less self-conscious, the writing of a person who had stopped needing to prove that she belonged and was simply doing the work. She wrote about what a newspaper was for, about the daily difficult job of trying to tell the truth about a community to itself, about what Cassidy Creek was and what it was still becoming, and about the privilege, which was the right word and she used it precisely, of being present for a town's becoming. William read it sitting at the kitchen table that morning, 7 months past his 10th birthday, with the quiet, focused attention he had begun bringing to the Courier's editorials in recent months, a development Charlotte watched with the careful neutrality of a parent who does not want to project. When he finished, he set it down and said, "This is why you do it," with the particular certainty of a person who has just understood something they had been close to for a long time. "Yes," Charlotte said. "I want to learn to write," he said, "the way you do, not just typesetting." She looked at him across the breakfast table, her oldest child, 10 years old and serious-eyed and asking for what he wanted with the directness she recognized as her own. "Then I'll teach you," she said. Dexter, from across the table, watched both of them and said nothing. But his expression said everything, the expression of a man who is watching the thing he built continue to grow beyond what he built it for, which was exactly what good building produced. Charlotte Rourke, who had come to the frontier with a partner and a press and a plan, and had lost the partner and the press and the plan and had found, in the specific way that losses sometimes generate unexpected gifts, something she had not been looking for and could not have imagined needing, put her coffee down and looked at her family in the morning light of a Colorado autumn and thought about a train platform and a running man and a sign saved from the ashes, and she thought, "I was done with the frontier." I said so clearly to myself and to everyone who would listen, I was done. She looked at the sign above the print shop door every day, Marcus's letters in their softened black paint, and she was not done. She would not be done. The frontier was in her now, not as the hostile thing it had once seemed, not as the thing that had taken her partner and her building and her certainty, but as the place where she had become the fullest version of herself, where she had built something real and been built in return, where she had found a man who understood that the way to change someone's mind was not to argue but to build something true and let them see it. She had said she was done with the frontier. She had meant it with her whole heart. And then Dexter Brooks had built something and she had seen it, and she had understood that she was not done at all and the train had left without her, and the life she was living now was the life she had not known to want, which was the only kind of life worth having, the one that surprises you into itself with the evidence of what is possible. The courier was still running. The lumber yard was still running. The children were growing into themselves with the speed and specificity that children achieve when they are free to do so. Cassidy Creek was still becoming, as towns continue to become as long as the people in them choose to stay and build. Charlotte chose. She kept choosing. Every morning when she walked down Larimer Street to the print shop and looked up at the sign, she chose it again, which was, she had come to understand, what it meant to stay somewhere. Not the single decision, but the daily re-choosing, the daily recommitment to the life you have built and the people you have built it with, and the work that gives the whole thing its shape and meaning. She opened the door of the courier and went inside, and the smell of ink and fresh paper rose around her like a second home, which it was. And she sat down at her desk and took out her notebook and began to write. And the day began, and it was good.